All right, folks, welcome to video number 4 in the Fikes Tips and Tricks series. This video is going to focus on research and support and organizing your speech. So far we've talked about a number of important topics. When it comes to the speech making process, we talked a lot about audience in one of the videos. We talked about how to build your confidence. The last video we talked about preparing your speech and picking your topics. So I want to focus on what I like to call as the meat and potatoes of a speech, right? The way you organize it, the delivery, all of that is sort of like whenever you have an arrangement on a dinner table. You have the way that you set up the plate and the knife and fork and the napkins and the jewelry, the silverware and all of that. But this is really the meat and potatoes. This is the actual meal, is the research and support. This is the content of the speech. So that's what I want to focus on, really important stuff. And so we're going to talk about research and support and organizing. We're going to talk about where you go for it, and then where you go for research and support, and then we're going to talk about how you use it. And so the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is where you go. Now, the first obvious choice with where you go for research and support would be the internet, of course, right? Google search. Google is our friend. I do Google search for almost everything when I'm initially starting a research project. So that can be your friend. Let me suggest, though, a few different ways that you can narrow your search so that you can find information that's going to be credible and most relevant, because the internet itself is kind of the wild, wild west. There's a lot of information out there that's frankly not going to be very helpful, or it might also just not be very accurate. So you want to be very mindful of the kind of research that you're using. So let me provide a couple of suggestions. The first is to narrow your search, and one of the ways to do it is by using not just Google, but Google Scholar. So if you go to scholar.google.com or just do a Google search for Google Scholar, you'll find it, and that's a really good source to use. Google Scholar will also allow you to narrow your search by the date range, the type of publication. So if you only want to have research from the last 4 years, which is what I would recommend you do for your speech, for maybe 5 years, then you can narrow that range. So Google Scholar is your friend. It's going to give you the access to peer-reviewed scholarly articles, to conference proceedings, which are pretty popular for business-type conferences. Is they publish the speeches in a print form, and then they publish them online. So that can be nice. So Google Scholar is really good. Of course, books, newspapers, those are really helpful. More realistically than going to the library and getting a book or getting a newspaper is you're probably going to want to search online. And so one good way to do that is by using our library database. So if you do a Google search for Belmont Library, you'll come up with the Lila Bunch Library site. If you search under databases, and then there's a long alphabetical list, you'll select L and look for LexisNexis. That'll give you access to about 6,000 sources, newspapers, conference proceedings, trade, all kinds of different publications. So that's a really good one. There's also a couple of really good ones. Nielsen has a source that's specific for music. So if you're looking for instance, data on streaming, if that's a speech that you want to focus on, I know some of you are music and entertainment business students, so that can be a good source. So just look around on those databases. That can be really handy, from LexisNexis or Nielsen, any of those. So make use of your resources that are not just the internet, but more specific things like from the library. So that can be really handy. If you're curious about what counts as a good, credible source, let me invite you to look under Fikes in our Blackboard site for killer handouts. You'll see one that says the ABCs of source quality, and that'll give you a sense of the types of sources that count, in terms of an A being the best source, a B being middle of the road, and a C being a source that you want to avoid. I'll give you a teaser on that. Wikipedia is a C source, so you want to avoid that. And then you can kind of see where some of the other ones fit. And if you ever have a question about a source and what's a good source or a bad source, just email me. Email me the source and I'll tell you, yeah, that's a good one. No, that's not a good one. It's always better to ask and find out and use that as a learning experience than to put it in a speech and have it not be very good, not be a good quality source. The second thing I want to talk about is, in addition to using sources online, that kind of thing, is within the speech itself, let me encourage you to think about different types of support. So for instance, metaphors, analogies, illustrations, examples, all those types of things. Of course, we think about using statistics and data, numbers, interview data, all of that, and that definitely counts. But the name of the game when it comes to using research, to using support in your speech, is variety. Okay, think about the kind of person you are. Do you like a speech? Do you like a TED Talk? Anything that gives all numbers and doesn't give any stories? On the other hand, do you like a speech that gives a ton of metaphors and stories but doesn't provide any facts to back it up or data? Right? So you want to have balance. You want to use a variety. Don't kill us with metaphor, but also don't kill us with numbers and research, because some people may get overwhelmed by the numbers. So you just want to have a variety. So the metaphor that I used to explain the importance of research and data, research and support, was the meal, right? Meat and potatoes. So that was a simple metaphor that I dropped in. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is just think about, in your speech, is there a metaphor that I can use? Can I start my speech with a story? Right? Those are all forms of support, right? We oftentimes think of support as it being hard data, but those can be support as well. So let me encourage you to really think about that. Probably my favorite example of an effective metaphor that was used in the last year in my speech class at Belmont was, I had a student who was doing a persuasive speech about depression and anxiety, and he was trying to persuade the audience to go seek help, right? So if you're feeling depressed, maybe borderline suicidal, because that was his reality, as he has attempted suicide before, he was trying to persuade the audience, don't wait until you're at your breaking point. Go seek help on an ongoing basis. And the metaphor that he used was a Coke bottle, right? And he had a bottle and he shook it up and he said, now if I open this bottle fast, it's going to explode. But if I slowly release it, right, then nothing will happen. It will slowly release all of the gas that's in there. So his whole point was to compare that to life experience, where go seek help on an ongoing basis. Don't wait till it's too late. The beautiful thing about that metaphor is, if you only remember that and nothing else from the speech, you remember his entire purpose of the speech, right? So that's the point I want to make to you. Let me encourage you to think about a metaphor, think about an analogy, something you can drop in that's going to help your audience understand the point that you're trying to make. And it all goes back to one of the things I mentioned in one of the previous videos, which is, what's your specific purpose? I want to inform my audience on, I want to persuade my audience to, whatever that purpose is. Then use something like, make sure that everything supports that. Data, interviews, analogies, whatever it is. So the last thing that I want to talk about here is the organization, the way that you organize your speech. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. One is topical, chronological, arranging things in space, right? If you're talking about geography, for instance, that's typically a way to organize it, is by things in space. Problem solution is pretty common for persuasive. Cause effect, right? It all depends on your purpose. What are you trying to do in the speech, and then organize it accordingly. The next thing I want to talk about is your outlines. So there's information in our textbook about how to come up with an outline, but let me invite you to look at the samples that I've provided. There's a template for an outline. There's some samples up there. So those are your friend. I want to encourage you to really use those and make the most out of those resources that I've put up there. And so for the informative and persuasive speech, you will be responsible for creating an outline and uploading that before the presentation. So make sure that you look at those samples so you kind of know the best way to organize some of those. And you get some ideas. It's nice to have an example, a template to use. So hopefully those help. All right, last part to this video is in terms of organization, in terms of how you put things together, is the intro and the conclusion, right? So every introduction of a speech has a few different parts to it. The first is you've got to get the audience's attention. So if you have a startling statistic or a story or a metaphor or a rhetorical question, that's a really good way to do that. The second thing is you establish credibility, right? So you talk about why you are an expert on that particular topic, or even not even really an expert, just what's your experience with that topic, and you include that. The next thing is that you want to make sure that you build relevance. So that's the what's in it for me. All goes back to the audience, right? Why should this audience care, right? If you can build relevance into the speech, it also helps you as a speaker become more comfortable, because you know you have information that's going to help the audience. So the what's in it for me question has to be answered early on in the speech. And then the last thing is you want to preview the speech, preview your main points, right? Even with these videos, the thing I do at the beginning is very brief. I just say, in this video, we're going to focus on two things. So there's nothing magical about it, but it really works to set the presentation up. If you watch every TED Talk, they always have some kind of a story, some kind of startling visual or whatever it is to get things started. So let me encourage you to do that. The last thing I want to talk about here is the conclusion. So on the conclusion, you always want to make sure that you've got a brief summary, right, of the content of the presentation. And then you want to have a little bit of a closer or a clincher, right? Give us a memorable thought. If it's a persuasive speech, typically you have a call to action. What is it that you want the audience to do? That's your very last chance with your audience, so you want to make the most of that opportunity and give them something that if they only remember one thing, they remember that when they walk out, right? And then in between all of that, so you get intro, inclusion. Of course, then that's the body, right? That's where you have your 2 to 3 main points, your supporting information like we've talked about, statistics, metaphors, data, whatever it is. And then you want to make sure that you have transitions in your speech. So, okay, we've covered this, now we're going to move on to this. So you'll read about all that in your textbook, but I wanted to mention some of those important things for you to think about and some of the things that I've seen that work particularly well. Last thing I want to point out here is make sure that whenever you're working on your speeches that you look at the rubric that's provided. You'll see all these different categories: intro, body, conclusion, delivery. You'll see everything that I'm going to be looking for as I give a speech, and that's all pretty standard stuff. So if you can figure it out and get comfortable with it now, it'll help you in future speech situations. So that's all I have for you now. I'm excited about the next video, which is going to be focused more on delivery. So I'll see you then.